Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a topic that, well, it's been all over the headlines, sparking some really intense debate across the country. We're talking about this significant United States federal mass layoffs happening right now in 2025. We've got quite a stack of sources here, detailed news analyses from places like CNN, the New York Times. We've got Supreme Court documents, background from think tanks, basically everything to help us unpack what's really going on. Our mission, like always, is to pull out those key nuggets of knowledge, give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. So what we're looking at here is this, well, unprecedented effort by the second Trump administration. The goal, to dramatically reduce the size and maybe the scope of the federal civil service. Initial announcements, we're talking about, over 275,000 potential layoffs. That's a huge number. And as of late June 2025, CNN alone had tracked, I think, at least 128,709 workers already laid off or targeted, and the New York Times confirmed cuts, buyouts, other reductions, adding up to roughly 12% of the 2.4 million civilian federal workers. The timing for us digging into this is, well, it's pretty crucial because just a couple of days ago, July 8th, 2025, the Supreme Court made a really pivotal decision, a decision that directly impacts all these ongoing changes. So let's really try to unpack what this all means for you and for the country. To really get a handle on the current situation, maybe we need to rewind a bit. Go back to the origins of this whole massive undertaking. What has the administration actually said are its core goals here? Is there like a clear philosophy driving these layoffs?
Yeah, that's really the fundamental question, isn't it? And what's quite striking here is the transparency, you could say, of the intent behind it all. The Trump administration has been pretty explicit. Their stated aims are, well, number one, significantly cut federal spending. Number two, lessen the federal government's power to regulate businesses. And number three, just generally shrink the government's overall role in American society. Russell Vought, who was OMB director before and is again now, he really laid it out quite starkly back in 2023. He said, and this is a direct quote, so it's worth hearing, "We want the bureaucrats to be traumatically affected. When they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work," he went on. "Oh, we want their funding to be shut down so that the EPA can't do all of the rules against our energy industry because they have no bandwidth financially to do so. We want to put them in trauma."
Wow, put them in trauma. I mean, that's a remarkably blunt statement of intent, isn't it? And it sounds like this isn't just some abstract policy idea, but a very focused initiative. Who's actually been spearheading this? Is there a new agency or maybe a high-profile person driving it?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of this has been driven by a newly established entity. It's called the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE for short. And maybe the most talked about part of this, billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk was brought in to lead it, appointed as a senior advisor to the president. Musk has been central, not just pushing for rapid downsizing, automation, privatization, things you might expect. But he's also been very vocal on social media, sometimes even, celebrating the terminations. And if you connect this to the sort of the bigger intellectual movement behind it, it's worth remembering the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. That project had already laid out really detailed policies for shrinking agencies, boosting White House power over the executive branch, and critically replacing career civil servants with loyalists seen as willing to enact the administration's agenda. So these layoffs, you could definitely see them as an active implementation of that kind of vision.
Okay, so we had the stated goals, efficiency, smaller government, less regulation, maybe even that trauma aspect, and we have the key players like DOGE and Musk. But how do they actually do it? How are these changes being put into practice on the ground? What were the specific mechanisms used to shrink the workforce so fast?
Right. It wasn't just one single action. It's been more like a series of overlapping stages, different tools being used. One of the very first big moves, this was back on January 28th, 2025, was an executive order. And this order removed what's known as Schedule F due process employment protections. Essentially, that action stripped thousands of federal employees, often those in policy-related roles, of their traditional civil service protections against political firings, made them effectively at-will employees.
At will. So basically removing that layer of job security they had, and how quickly did that translate into people actually losing jobs? Were there other ways they pushed people out too?
Very quickly. And yes, there was another key mechanism also rolled out right around that same time, January 28th. It was called a deferred resignation deal, essentially an offer, right? Employees could voluntarily resign then and there, usually in exchange for some kind of benefit package. The implied alternative being potential termination later under that new Schedule F status, and reports say about 75,000 federal workers took that deal by mid-February.
75,000?
Yeah.
That's a lot, and it raises that question you mentioned. Was it really voluntary or kind of a forced choice under pressure?
Exactly. That was a big debate. And beyond that, they also targeted tens of thousands of probationary employees.
Mm.
These are generally newer hires, people may be transferred or promoted within the last year or so. They have fewer protections traditionally. And there were reports that agencies were even told to tell these fired employees their performance was inadequate, but without actually needing to provide any evidence.
Just tell them that regardless.
That's what was reported, yes. And that, understandably, ignited protests. There was a notable one on President's Day, for instance.
Okay, so things were moving incredibly fast. But surely, with changes this big and this rapid, there must have been some immediate problems, practical challenges, any pushback that actually worked initially.
Oh, definitely. They hit some snags, for sure. In a few limited but important cases, the administration actually had to walk back layoff notices. For example, some Department of Agriculture folks working on the H5N1 bird flu outbreak, they were reinstated. Same for some staff at the National Nuclear Security Administration. But here's the catch. Some of those employees had already lost access to their government email accounts, so supervisors apparently had trouble even contacting them to tell them they were rehired.
That sounds chaotic.
It does. And the FDA also reportedly rehired some key staff needed for reviewing medical devices and food safety. It really highlighted the immediate operational impact these cuts could have. And alongside these immediate firings and buyouts, agency leaders were also ordered to submit plans for much larger scale reductions in force, or RIFs. That deadline was March 14th. And the stated goal for those RIFs was huge, targeting around 1/3 of the federal workforce. That's something like 700,000 employees.
A third of the workforce.
Yeah.
700,000 people. That's just staggering. And I remember there was also that controversial email directive around February that caused a huge uproar. Can you remind us what that was about?
Yes, that was a big flashpoint. On February 22nd, 2025, this email directive came out from the Office of Personnel Management, OPM. It basically mandated that all federal employees had to provide a weekly summary of their work. And then Elon Musk tweeted something like, failure to respond will be taken as a resignation. That really amplified it.
So respond or you're fired, essentially.
That was the implication, yes. And it faced massive pushback. Immediately, several agencies, even the judiciary, told their own employees to hold off, don't respond yet. And it went to court quickly. On February 27th, a federal judge actually ruled that OPM didn't have the authority to fire employees outside of its own agency just based on that directive. So that specific mechanism was stopped legally pretty early on.
Okay, so we've covered the executive orders, the buyouts, the probationary firings, the RIF plans, that email directive attempt. But let's get to the core question for you, our listener. What does this actually mean for the services we all interact with? How are these cuts impacting what government agencies can actually do?
Well, as you said, this whole effort has been called the largest attempt to reorganize the federal government since, the professional civil service was even established over a century ago to prevent political interference. And the impact, it's incredibly broad. Reports by May 2025 were saying these cuts had, and this is a quote from some analyses, effectively wiped out several entire federal departments and agencies. We're talking about the Department of Education, AmeriCorps, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAA, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. Gone or drastically reduced.
Effectively wiped out. So these are just minor trims. We're talking fundamental changes to how or even if certain government functions operate.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give some more concrete examples, say, for specific agencies people might know?
Sure. Let's look at a few key ones. At USAA, as I mentioned, nearly all 10,000 employees were either fired or furloughed. The workforce was cut down to maybe around 300 people.
300 from 10,000.
Yeah. And obviously that has inevitably disrupted humanitarian aid programs all over the world. At the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, over 300 probationary employees were let go. These included people enforcing cornerstone laws like the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, people restoring environmental permits for projects. The risk there is clear. Delays in critical oversight, slower response to pollution issues. Then there's the Department of Agriculture, USDA. They got about 5,600 employees fired. This hit services like the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Forest Service. Experts warned this could jeopardize everything from technical help for farmers and ranchers to agricultural research on climate change and pests, even wildfire prevention.
And what about areas like veteran services? Or something as basic as taxes? Surely those are essential.
Even those weren't spared. The Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, dismissed over 1,000 probationary employees. And this included researchers working on really critical issues: mental health, cancer treatments, the effects of burn pit exposure. And the VA apparently has a broader goal of cutting 30,000 employees by September of 2025.
30,000 from
Yeah.
the VA.
Yeah, and the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, they fired between 6,000 and 7,000 probationary employees. And the timing was crucial right during the peak tax filing season. So concerns were immediately raised about delays in processing tax returns, less help for taxpayers trying to file, and importantly, reduced enforcement, which would actually lower the amount of revenue collected. Even the government's own internal support sisters were hit. The General Services Administration, GSA, reportedly saw entire regional offices effectively fired. And the 18F team, which was this group focused on modernizing government software and websites, making things work better online, they were basically deleted, with about 90 tech specialists let go.
It's easy to get caught up in the sheer scale of those numbers and the operational impacts. But what about the people involved? The human cost of all this? What's the effect on the workers still there or those who lost their jobs?
That's a really important point and maybe gets lost sometimes. Beyond the numbers, the reports paint a grim picture. They talk about widespread intimidation and fear among the remaining federal workers. We're hearing accounts of people suffering from panic attacks, from depression, even tragically, reports mentioning suicidal thoughts. And it's hard not to connect that back to Russell Vaught's stated goal, that chilling phrase, to put bureaucrats in trauma. The whole rollout seems to have been incredibly chaotic for many individuals. Reports describe a roller coaster experience, people being fired, then maybe rehired, then threatened with firing again. It points to a profound level of disruption and, frankly, psychological distress within the workforce.
Okay, so with actions this widespread, this rapid, and causing this much disruption, legal challenges were pretty much inevitable, right? We saw lower courts stepping in initially, putting temporary holds, injunctions on many of these firings. But then, just this week, July 8th, the Supreme Court weighed in. That felt like a major turning point.
It absolutely was. That brings us right up to the present. The Supreme Court's decision just a couple of days ago is highly significant. In an 8-1 decision, the court granted what's called a stay. That effectively overrides the lower court's preliminary injunction. And the immediate effect of that ruling is that it allows the Trump administration's executive order and the memo implementing it for these large-scale workforce reductions to move forward while the deeper legal battles continue.
So the court basically said the administration was likely to succeed on the argument that the overall order and memo were lawful. But there was a really important caveat in there, too, wasn't there? What did they explicitly not rule on yet?
Yes, and that nuance is critical. While they gave the green light for the process of downsizing to continue, the majority opinion very carefully added, and this is key, that they expressed no view on the legality of any agency RAF and reorganization plan produced or approved pursuant to the executive order and memorandum. What that means is the specific plans from individual agencies, how they plan to cut staff, restructure those, weren't technically before the court in this decision. So those specific plans can still be challenged legally down the road.
Interesting. So the overall policy framework can proceed, but specific applications are still open to challenge.
Exactly. And it's also interesting, Justice Sotomayor, she actually concurred with the majority, a bit of a rare break from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on cases like this. Sotomayor agreed a president can't just restructure agencies against what Congress mandated, but she pointed out the executive order itself said the plans had to be consistent with applicable law. So she basically said, fine, let the process continue, but the lower courts are still free to look at whether the specific plans developed are actually legal later on.
Right. And then you had Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson as the lone dissenter. And her dissent was reportedly quite strong, quite critical.
It was extremely powerful, yeah. Justice Jackson called the majority decision hubristic and senseless. She argued the majority just casually discarded pages and pages of detailed evidence-based reasoning from the lower court. She described what's happening as an apparently unprecedented and congressionally unsanctioned dismantling of the federal government. Her words. She warned about irreparable harm and said the ruling could potentially allow the president to effectively rewrite laws on his own by reshaping the agencies that implement them. She kept pointing back to the lower court's findings, which suggested this wasn't just trimming, but a massive restructuring, something that historically needs explicit approval from Congress.
So a procedural win for the administration, allowing the process to continue, but the fight over the legality of the actual cuts and reorganizations is far from over.
Precisely. It's a big shift from what people thought of as the pre-Trump conventional wisdom about federal job security. It definitely allows the threat of layoffs to be used, potentially to pressure workers, or, as some argue, to root out dissent.
Okay, so let's step back from the immediate legal fight for a moment. Looking at the bigger picture, what does all this really mean for the future? For the federal government as an institution, for its workforce, for us as citizens, what are the broader implications here?
Well, connecting it to that bigger picture, this is being framed, as we discussed, as potentially the largest reorganization attempt since the modern civil service was created. The implications for the balance of power between the White House and Congress are pretty profound. It really brings up that fundamental question. Who gets to decide the shape and function of our government? Is it the executive branch acting alone, or does Congress need to be more involved in changes this significant? It absolutely redefines the landscape for federal employment. It could empower future presidents, of either party perhaps, to use the threat of layoffs more readily to ensure compliance or loyalty. And it directly impacts those core civil service protections, things like job security, protection from political influence, which were originally designed to foster apolitical expertise and continuity in government. There's another angle, too. Some initial analyses are suggesting that agencies with higher percentages of women, minority employees, and black employees might have been disproportionately affected by some of the cuts. And some observers connect this to broader administration efforts targeting what they call DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within the government.
So that raises potential questions about equity, about access. Federal jobs have historically been a pathway to the middle class for many different groups.
Exactly. That's another layer to consider in the long-term impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's incredibly clear that these mass federal layoffs, they're so much more than just numbers on a page, aren't they? They really represent a fundamental reshaping, potentially, of our government, with consequences that stretch far and wide for how services get delivered, how policy gets made, and really the whole nature of public service in the U.S. We've looked at the administration's stated goals, efficiency, smaller government, maybe that trauma element. We've seen the unprecedented ways they're implementing it, the real-world impacts hitting critical services, and now these complex legal fights reaching the Supreme Court. So for you, our listener, maybe here's a final thought to chew on, something provocative perhaps. How might these incredibly rapid, sweeping changes to the people who make up our federal government redefine the fundamental relationship between that government and us, the governed? And maybe even more critically, what does it mean for accountability when transformations this significant happen largely through executive action, arguably without that clear, upfront stamp of approval from Congress? Lots to keep thinking about, and we definitely encourage you to keep exploring and asking those critical questions.